The raw November fog of 1895 had settled upon London with particular malevolence that morning, transforming the familiar thoroughfares into a labyrinth of grey phantoms and muffled echoes. From our lodgings at 221B Baker Street, the city appeared as though viewed through soiled gauze, with only the occasional gas lamp piercing the gloom like a lonely sentinel. Holmes had been in one of his contemplative moods that week, his violin serving as the sole outlet for a restless mind that found little stimulation in the dreary procession of days. He lay stretched upon the settee in characteristic repose, those long, pale fingers folded beneath his chin, when the sharp rap of knuckles against our door announced what would prove to be one of the most perplexing cases ever to challenge his considerable faculties. Mrs. Hudson appeared with an apologetic flutter, followed closely by Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. The little detective's ferret-bright eyes bore that peculiar mixture of vexation and desperate hope which springs from encountering a puzzle too formidable to abandon yet too complex to solve. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of hasty preparation, and his normally composed demeanor had given way to barely contained agitation. Lestrade began without preamble, declining the chair I offered with a dismissive gesture. I do not make a habit of playing herald to the penny press, but if the Pink Un does not have the man who never breathed upon its bills by evening, I shall eat my hat and your Persian slipper into the bargain. Holmes uncoiled from the settee with feline grace, his grey eyes immediately sharpening with that peculiar intensity which indicated his complete and undivided attention. "You interest me greatly, Lestrade," he murmured, setting aside his violin with deliberate precision. "If this concerns a living man who never breathed, I must excuse myself. I have had my fill of spiritualists and their theatrical nonsense. If it involves a dead man, however, you are either poet or physician, and either promises considerable entertainment." "Neither poet nor physician," Lestrade replied, taking the offered seat and casting a meaningful glance at my medical instruments upon the mantel. "But I have a coroner with a reputation to preserve, a barrister with a career to establish, and a room that proves devilishly difficult to both enter and exit. I am sent to beg your attendance at the mortuary, and afterwards at Welbeck Street. The inquest is fixed for 3 o'clock, time enough if you will come. Watson," Holmes declared with that dry rumble which invariably presaged action, "your hat and coat, if you please." As our hansom navigated the fog-shrouded streets, Lestrade delivered the facts in his characteristically clipped fashion. "The deceased is one Oswald Penrith of 18 Welbeck Street, a gentleman of education and considerable means, though something of a recluse in recent years. He inherited substantial funds from a Birmingham uncle who manufactured pots and kettles for half the railway companies in the kingdom. Of late, Mr. Penrith had taken to scientific pursuits, pumps, glass apparatus, retorts, electrical batteries, and such mechanical contraptions. A harmless enough occupation, according to his housekeeper, though the odors emanating from his experimental chambers would turn a strong man's stomach before breakfast." "Ah," Holmes exclaimed with evident satisfaction, "a devotee of the pneumatic sciences. Pray continue, Inspector." "Yesterday afternoon he was observed at approximately 4 o'clock by a commissionaire delivering a parcel. At 6, the housemaid carried his dinner tray to the study door, the same chamber he employed for his scientific work, but found it securely locked. This was not unusual, as he preferred to conduct his experiments without disturbance. At 9 o'clock, the housekeeper herself attempted entry, finding it peculiar that he had not dined. The door remained locked, with no response to repeated summons. This morning, the key was discovered in the keyhole upon the inside. When no answer was forthcoming, a locksmith was summoned to force entry." Holmes leaned forward with keen interest. "And the condition of the room?" "Sealed as tight as a tomb, Mr. Holmes. The fire had died to embers, the windows were latched from within, and a small skylight was secured with both bolt and screw. Mr. Penrith was discovered seated in his armchair beside the desk, his head thrown back and his countenance. Lestrade paused, visibly disturbed by the memory. Well, you shall see for yourself. No marks of violence were evident, no signs of struggle or disorder. The only unusual element was a large glass bell, rather like a cheese cover for a giant lying upon its side on the carpet, with a length of India rubber tubing attached. As for his appearance, his face was blue as a winter plum, and his lips the color of ripe sloes. "Most intriguing," Holmes murmured, his eyelids drooping in that manner, which indicated intense mental calculation. "And what does the coroner make of these circumstances?" Dr. Edmund Hatherley of Bloomsbury, a man of considerable experience and unimpeachable reputation. His preliminary findings have set all of Fleet Street buzzing. Lestrade withdrew a folded document from his pocket. "You are familiar, I believe, with the hydrostatic test employed in cases of suspected infanticide, the examination to determine whether an infant's lungs have ever known the breath of life." "Indeed," I interjected. "The test determines whether the lungs will float in water, indicating they have been inflated with air." "Precisely, Doctor." "Well, Dr. Hatherley, to satisfy some professional curiosity of his own, removed the deceased's lungs with surgical precision. He placed them in his examination basin, and down they went, both organs together, like stones cast into a pond. He separated them, tested individual lobes, tried various approaches. Whether whole or divided, they sank without trace. "Gentlemen," he announced to the assembled officials, "we have before us the lungs of a man who has never drawn breath." Even in the dim, fog-filtered light of our carriage, I observed Holmes's eyes quicken with intellectual hunger. The deceased's age? 38 years. The lungs showed congestion? Congested, certainly, but not in the manner we might expect. No froth, such as accompanies drowning. No sooting within the mouth or nostrils. The tongue was not protruding. The skin showed cyanosis, but not the bright cherry red associated with carbon monoxide poisoning. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "And his position when discovered?" "Seated normally in his chair. Boots upon his feet. There was a darker patch in the carpet near his chair, no blood or other fluid, merely as if some heavy object had rested there and been subsequently moved. The glass bell apparatus was found some 3 feet distant, partially overturned. The room carried a distinctive odor. Mr. Holmes, not gas, not spirits, but something reminiscent of eucalyptus pastilles, though considerably sharper and more penetrating. "Were there papers upon his desk?" Holmes inquired. "A letter half-written and a blotter bearing curious markings. The blotter showed a single word repeated numerous times in a firm hand. Respice. Look back, if my schoolboy Latin serves." His pocket watch had stopped at precisely 1:45. Holmes's fingers drummed a silent melody upon his knee. "You forced entry at 9 in the morning, discovering him with a timepiece arrested some 12 hours earlier. What testimony does the household provide?" The housekeeper, Mrs. Manley, defends her master's character most stoutly. She describes him as charitable and afflicted with delicate health, a family weakness of the chest, which she claims drove him to his pneumatic experiments. He received few visitors. A Mr. Julius Varden, a barrister with the countenance of a hawk, called on Tuesday last. A foreign lady visited a fortnight ago and departed in evident distress, leaving no name. And his nephew, Lionel Penrith, arrives each Sunday for his weekly allowance and the inevitable lecture on moral improvement. The nephew's financial circumstances, light as thistledown, by all accounts. However, he was engaged in a card game at Duke Street during the relevant hours. We have verified his alibi thoroughly. We are keeping him readily available for questioning." Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me. A hermetically sealed chamber. A timepiece frozen in time, classical Latin inscribed as if by rote. pneumatic apparatus of unknown purpose, and a coroner who has provided Fleet Street with headlines to last a month. If I may say so, Lestrade, your case begins with sufficient mystery to warrant a most satisfying conclusion. We found the mortuary redolent with the sharp scent of preserving spirits, its whitewashed walls gleaming with institutional cleanliness. Dr. Hatherley received us with professional gravity, though his manner softened perceptibly upon recognizing Holmes's reputation. "I fear I have been indiscreet, Mr. Holmes," the coroner began, "though not untruthful. I am well aware how the sensationalist press will distort my findings. I do not assert for one moment that Mr. Penrith passed through life without breathing. I state only that his pulmonary organs, when subjected to hydrostatic examination, behaved precisely as those of an infant before its first cry." Holmes inclined his head respectfully. "And what conclusions do you draw from this phenomenon, Doctor?" "I can only infer that either the conditions within those organs were altered posthumously in some manner I do not yet comprehend, or that some extraordinary process preceded death which rendered them thus. There is no froth indicative of drowning, no ecchymoses upon the epiglottis suggesting strangulation. The mucous membranes show a pallid lilac discoloration rather than the livid purple of asphyxiation. He died, Mr. Holmes, from oxygen deprivation, but not through any form of suffocation I can readily identify or explain. The examination of the deceased revealed a man whose features had been composed into that terrible neutrality which death imposes, erasing every trace of personality and leaving only the stark architecture of bone beneath. The bluish tinge of the lips spoke of severe respiratory distress, while the fingertips bore a faint, dusky discoloration. I noted a curious flatness to the chest cavity, as though the ribs had been drawn inward in a final, desperate effort to draw breath. Most intriguingly, a tiny circular mark adorned the right forearm, no larger than a pinprick half concealed beneath the dark hair. Holmes's examination was characteristically thorough, yet seemingly casual. His keen gaze roamed without apparent focus before settling upon specific details with laser-like intensity. With negligent grace that would have deceived any observer save myself, he lifted the deceased's chin slightly and bent close, not to examine the teeth or tongue as medical protocol might suggest, but to investigate the nostrils with the delicate precision of a bloodhound detecting a scent. He brushed the temple hair with one finger, then straightened, his expression distant and calculating. "You are certain," he addressed Dr. Hatherley, "that when the study door was forced, all windows remained secure and the skylight properly fastened?" "I was present during the entry, sir. The room was sealed as completely as any vault." "And the experimental apparatus?" "A large bell glass, suitable for covering candles or botanical specimens. Flexible tubing. A small hand-operated pump. There is also a gasometer in one corner, a jar containing greenish crystals, and that persistent odor which seems to permeate my very clothing." "Chlorate of potash, perhaps," I ventured, drawing upon my medical knowledge. "Or possibly menthol compounds." Dr. Hatherley shrugged helplessly. "I make no pretense to chemical expertise, Doctor." "Nor do I," Holmes replied with deceptive lightness, "though I confess to a modest acquaintance with those elements which occasionally assist the criminally inclined." He turned to Lestrade with sudden decision. "Inspector, I would request one favor. Delay the jury's deliberations for precisely 1 hour past 3 o'clock. Grant me access to the Welbeck Street premises during that interval yourself and one constable, no more." Lestrade's moustache twitched with nervous energy. "If you will stake your reputation upon it, Mr. Holmes, I shall stake mine. However, I warn you that I cannot restrain the press indefinitely." "1 hour will suffice," Holmes assured him. "Watson, we shall dine upon haste today." He bowed courteously to the coroner. "Dr. Hatherley, you have provided something invaluable, an honest acknowledgement of the limits of current knowledge. Such intellectual honesty is the foundation upon which true understanding is built. One final question. Was any documentation found upon Mr. Penrith's person? The coroner hesitated momentarily. A folded slip in his waistcoat pocket, apparently a list of recent purchases. India rubber tubing, 2 yards. Oil of peppermint, small bottle. Wire, fine gauge. Muriatic acid, 1 pint. Blotting papers, assorted. His fingernails also bore traces of a fine grey powder, rather like pulverized stone. Holmes's nostrils flared with interest. Powder, you say? Precisely, like powdered limestone or chalk. Holmes bowed as though acknowledging a masterful performance. We shall proceed to Welbeck Street immediately, Lestrade. As our hansom bore us through the fog-shrouded streets toward our destination, the city pressed closer around us like a living thing of damp brick and muffled hoofbeats. Holmes sat with his chin buried in his collar, eyes fixed upon the smeared window glass, lost in the private calculations that preceded his most brilliant deductions. I could not restrain my curiosity. You have formed a theory, I observed. I possess a single atom of truth, he replied cryptically. If that atom proves genuine, the molecule will inevitably follow. Consider the evidence, Watson. A distinctive odor clinging to the deceased's hair, an impression upon the carpet, a Latin word obsessively inscribed, and a learned physician who, being no fool, announces a medical impossibility. Such a combination would intrigue even the most pedestrian mind. It sets mine positively racing. He paused, a thin smile playing about his lips. Tell me, do you recall our adventure with the asphyxiated coal heaver in Tooley Street? The charcoal brazier incident. His wife had sealed the windows against the cold. Precisely. In that case, we had a brazier and sealed windows. Here, we find no brazier and no evidence of tampering with the room's ventilation, yet the air itself has clearly been manipulated. The question is not, how was this man deprived of breath, but rather, what breath filled that glass apparatus, and whose lungs expelled it? His smile broadened with genuine anticipation as he rapped twice upon the carriage roof, signaling the driver to increase our pace through the fog-bound streets. Thus we approached the house in Welbeck Street, where a dead man had seated himself among all the paraphernalia of modern science, secured himself within an impregnable chamber, and died in a manner that defied every principle of medical knowledge, like an infant who had never drawn its first breath of life. The game, as Holmes would say, was afoot. The house at 18 Welbeck Street presented itself with the somber dignity of Victorian respectability, its red brick facade unmarked by any suggestion of the extraordinary drama that had unfolded within its walls. The fog seemed to cling more tenaciously to its windows, as though the very atmosphere recognized the presence of mystery and sought to shroud it from casual observation. A single constable stood sentinel at the entrance, his breath forming small clouds in the November chill as he acknowledged our arrival with a respectful nod. Mrs. Manley, the housekeeper, received us in the narrow hallway with the composed dignity of one who had weathered considerable storms. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years. Her grey hair arranged with mathematical precision beneath a starched cap, her dark dress bearing not a single wrinkle, despite the extraordinary circumstances that had befallen her household. Her manner suggested both grief and bewilderment, though she maintained the professional reserve that years of domestic service had instilled. "The study remains precisely as we found it, gentlemen," she informed us, her voice carrying the measured cadences of one accustomed to speaking with authority. "Nothing has been disturbed, save for the removal of poor Mr. Penrith himself." Holmes's grey eyes swept the modest interior with characteristic intensity, noting the worn carpet runners, the carefully maintained woodwork, and the subtle signs of a household managed with economy yet maintained with pride. "You have served the Penrith family for some considerable time, I perceive." 16 years this coming Christmas, sir. I came to Mr. Penrith when he first inherited from his uncle in Birmingham. A more considerate employer would be difficult to find, though his scientific pursuits did create certain domestic challenges. And yesterday afternoon, Holmes continued with that deceptive casualness which invariably preceded his most penetrating inquiries. You observed nothing unusual in his manner or routine. Mrs. Manley's composed features flickered with the shadow of recollection. He seemed particularly animated, sir, almost excited. When I brought his morning tea, he was arranging his apparatus with unusual care, muttering calculations under his breath. He asked me to ensure that no one disturbed him after 4 o'clock, as he intended to conduct what he termed a crucial experiment. He also requested that I prepare a light supper rather than his usual dinner, as he expected to be occupied until quite late. The odors from his experiments, Lestrade interjected. You mentioned them previously. Indeed, Inspector. Sharp, medicinal scents that would penetrate the entire house despite his efforts to contain them. Yesterday's was particularly pungent, reminiscent of the peppermint pastilles he favored for his delicate chest, yet sharper, more penetrating. Holmes nodded thoughtfully as Mrs. Manley produced a key from her pocket and led us up the narrow staircase. The upper hallway stretched before us, punctuated by several doors, but our destination was immediately apparent from the lingering traces of that peculiar medicinal odor. Even through the closed door, the scent was perceptible, sharp, penetrating, and utterly unlike anything in my medical experience. Penrith's study bore fresh scars from the locksmith's tools around the jamb. As it swung open, a wave of the peculiar, sharp odor washed over us, overlaying the stale air of an undisturbed room. The study revealed itself as a testament to its late occupant's singular pursuits. Bookshelves, lined with scientific tomes, competing for space with an array of glass tubes, coiled wires, and polished brass instruments. Holmes stepped into the chamber with reverent precision, his eyes absorbing every detail simultaneously. The large glass bell lay overturned on the Persian rug, connected by black India rubber tubing to a small hand-operated pump on the desk. The darker circular impression where it had originally rested was clearly visible in the carpet's nap. Without comment, Holmes took a wax taper from the mantel, struck a vesta, and lowered the wavering flame from throat height to knee. At mid-room, it burned true. A foot lower, it guttered. Upon the carpet, it sighed and died. He relit and repeated the experiment at the bell glass's overturned mouth, where the flame surrendered at an even higher level. "Heavier than air, Watson," he murmured. Our visitor was no mere draught. He crossed to a squat gasometer in the corner, stooped, and with a nail pared from his pocket-knife, scraped a crescent of grey substance from the valve seat. He tapped a grain upon his tongue, then spat briskly into his handkerchief. "Chalky, your muriatic acid has had a companion." He poured a thimbleful of water from a beaker into a porcelain capsule, dropped a pinch of the powder, and smiled as the faintest effervescence stirred the surface. "Carbonate. A respectable method for raising a suffocating cloud, if one has patience." "And the peppermint, Mr. Holmes?" Lestrade inquired. "To keep the household from carrying tales of vinegar and vaults," Holmes replied. "A considerate poisoner perfumes his sins." He lifted the bell glass by its rim, testing the edge with a forefinger. "Beeswax. Observe the faint dulling upon the ground lip." He desired a perfect seal. His eyes measured the relationship between the chair and the carpet impression. The bell stood here initially, not where we found it. After use it was moved aside, and too hastily for his usual scientific precision. Holmes turned to the desk where the blotter lay, its surface bearing the obsessive repetition of respice. When he held it to the light at an angle, faint impressions became visible, reversed characters that spoke of pressure from above. Holmes declared, his eyes bright with intellectual satisfaction. "We have before us not suicide, but scientific theatre of the most elaborate kind, performed for an audience of one." Holmes moved with deliberate precision to the blotter, holding it at an angle to catch the pale November light filtering through the study's grimy windows. The impressed characters gradually revealed themselves like a photographic plate developing in solution, their reversed forms spelling out fragments that spoke of legal consultations and financial arrangements. Julius Varden, he read softly, his voice carrying that note of satisfaction which indicated another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Draft codicil, transfer of trusteeship. And our persistent Latin friend, respice. He set the blotter aside and turned to Mrs. Manley, who had remained standing in the doorway with the patient dignity of long service. You mentioned that your master received correspondence yesterday morning? Indeed, sir. A single letter bearing foreign postmarks, Italian, I believe, though the script was unfamiliar to me. Mr. Penrith read it during breakfast and immediately sequestered himself in this very room. He emerged only once, to dispatch young Tommy from next door to the chemist with a written list and sufficient coin for whatever supplies were required. Holmes's grey eyes sharpened with interest. The supplies being? I could not say with certainty, sir. The boy returned with a brown paper parcel which Mr. Penrith received personally, handling it with unusual care. He seemed particularly animated afterward, almost excited, though there was something in his manner that suggested anxiety as well. While Mrs. Manley spoke, Holmes had moved to examine the gasometer more closely, his keen gaze noting the fresh scratches around one brass valve and the modified connections that spoke of recent alterations. The apparatus bore signs of hurried adaptation, as though its original configuration had been insufficient for some particular purpose. He scraped a sample of the grey powder from the valve seat and tested it upon his tongue, grimacing at the chalky, bitter taste. Carbonate of lime, he murmured, generated by the action of muriatic acid upon limestone or chalk. A reliable method for producing carbon dioxide gas, though the quantities involved suggest an experiment of considerable scale. He lifted the India rubber tubing, noting how it had been cut and reconnected with fresh joinings. The apparatus has been modified to concentrate the gas at a specific level. Observe how the tubing has been shortened and the delivery point lowered. Lestrade consulted his pocket watch with evident anxiety. Mr. Holmes, the inquest jury reconvenes in 18 minutes. If you have formed any conclusions regarding this extraordinary death, I must request your immediate observations. Patience, Inspector. The truth emerges like a photograph in developer gradually, and only when the proper chemical conditions have been established. Holmes moved to the fireplace, stirring the cold ashes with his pocket knife. Among the grey remnants, he discovered several fragments of charred paper bearing traces of blue ink and the distinctive watermark of legal stationery. Our experimenter was methodical in destroying evidence, yet hasty in his final moments. The timing becomes increasingly significant. He straightened and surveyed the room with the air of a conductor preparing to direct a complex musical performance. Mrs. Manley, I require one final service. Please summon Mr. Lionel Penrith immediately. His uncle's effects require urgent attention, and his presence is essential for the proper settlement of the estate. The housekeeper's composed features registered surprise. But, sir, young Mr. Penrith departed for Brighton this very morning. He mentioned urgent business that could not be postponed, something about a racing investment that required his immediate attention. Most unusual, as he typically maintains his Sunday visits with religious punctuality. Holmes's expression transformed, a look of triumph flickering across his austere features. Brighton, you say? How remarkably prescient of young Lionel to anticipate urgent business on the very morning his uncle's death would be discovered. He turned to Lestrade with renewed energy. Inspector, we have before us not merely a death, but a carefully orchestrated performance designed to confound investigation and conceal murder most foul. The sealed room, the impossible medical evidence, the theatrical apparatus, all elements in an elaborate deception intended to suggest scientific accident rather than deliberate homicide. "Holmes?" Lestrade demanded. The room was sealed, no signs of struggle, and the medical evidence, my dear Inspector, is precisely what the murderer intended us to discover. We have been presented with a stage set, complete with props, timing, and a script written in Latin to guide the unwary observer. The question is not how the killer entered this sealed chamber, but how death itself was delivered to a man who believed himself safe within his own sanctuary. Holmes moved with characteristic precision to examine the door jamb where the locksmith's tools had scarred the wood, his pocket lens emerging as he scrutinized every detail of the lock mechanism. His long fingers traced the keyhole's perimeter with surgical delicacy, pausing at several minute scratches that marred the brass escutcheon. "Most illuminating," he murmured, withdrawing a length of fine wire so thin it might have been mistaken for a spider's thread. The wire terminated in a flattened loop, and when Holmes drew it gently through the keyhole from the corridor side, it emerged with the key still attached to its interior end. "So much for a door locked from within," he observed with quiet satisfaction. "A simple mechanism, Watson, requiring only patience and a steady hand. The key is turned from inside, the wire withdrawn, leaving every appearance of a chamber sealed by its occupant." He pocketed the wire with the care of a collector preserving a rare specimen. Our murderer possessed both mechanical ingenuity and intimate knowledge of his victim's habits. Lestrade consulted his timepiece with mounting anxiety. "Mr. Holmes, the inquest jury grows restless, and I have promised them a resolution within the hour. If you have evidence of murder, evidence requires proper interpretation. Inspector, and interpretation demands complete understanding of the method employed." Holmes returned to the overturned bell glass, lifting it carefully and positioning it over the dark impression in the carpet. The ground rim settled into the compressed fibers with mathematical precision, revealing traces of beeswax that had been applied to ensure an airtight seal. "Observe the systematic preparation. This apparatus was modified specifically for its deadly purpose." Mrs. Manley cleared her throat respectfully. "If I may, gentlemen, young Tommy from next door has been waiting in the kitchen. He seems most anxious to speak with someone regarding yesterday's events." Holmes's grey eyes sharpened immediately. "By all means, Mrs. Manley. The testimony of children often proves invaluable, as they observe without the prejudices that cloud adult perception." The boy who appeared in the doorway was perhaps 12 years of age, his cap clutched nervously in his hands, and his wide eyes taking in the scientific apparatus with undisguised fascination. Holmes bent to the child's level with surprising gentleness, his voice losing its customary edge of analytical detachment. "Tommy, I understand you performed a service for Mr. Penrith yesterday afternoon. Can you tell me about your journey to the chemist?" The lad's voice carried the clear tones of honest recollection. "Yes, sir. Mr. Penrith gave me a written list and coins enough for whatever was needed. But on my way, a gentleman stopped me, tall fellow with a sharp nose and a walking stick. He asked if I was running errands for the house, and when I said yes, he told me to make haste, as the matter was urgent. He gave me 2pence for my trouble and said Mr. Penrith was expecting the supplies immediately." Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me. "This gentleman, did you recognize him?" "No, sir, though he seemed to know about Mr. Penrith's work. He smelled strongly of peppermints, but sharper somehow. Like the pastilles had been mixed with something medicinal. Made my eyes water a bit when he leaned close." "And the supplies from the chemist?" "Sealed packets and bottles, sir. The chemist seemed to know what was wanted," said Mr. Penrith was a regular customer for his scientific work. "I delivered everything directly to the study door, and Mr. Penrith received the parcel personally, handling it with unusual care." Holmes straightened, his expression grave with the weight of mounting evidence. "Mrs. Manley, when did Mr. Lionel Penrith last visit his uncle?" "Sunday last, sir, as was his custom, though he seemed more agitated than usual, spending considerable time in private conversation with his uncle. I heard raised voices at one point, though I could not distinguish the words. And his departure this morning for Brighton, was this planned in advance? The housekeeper's composed features registered genuine surprise. Not to my knowledge, sir, young Mr. Lionel typically announces his travel plans well in advance, as he often requires small loans to cover his expenses. His sudden departure struck me as most unusual. Holmes moved to the desk where the half-finished letter lay among scattered papers, his keen gaze absorbing every detail of the firm handwriting. The correspondence speaks of altered wills and redirected charitable intentions. Combined with young Lionel's financial difficulties and his convenient absence, we begin to see the true scope of this elaborate deception. He turned to Lestrade with renewed energy. Inspector, I require immediate action. Send word to Brighton to detain Mr. Lionel Penrith on suspicion of murder. Summon Mr. Julius Varden to attend us here within the hour, and ensure that no one disturbs this study until our investigation is complete. The fog outside seemed to press more closely against the windows, as though the very atmosphere recognized that the truth was finally emerging from the shadows of deception and scientific theater that had concealed it. The constable's hurried departure to dispatch Holmes's urgent telegrams left an expectant silence in the study, broken only by the persistent ticking of the mantel clock and the soft hiss of gas escaping from the modified apparatus. Holmes moved with renewed purpose to the overturned bell glass, positioning it precisely over the dark impression in the carpet where it had originally rested. The ground rim settled into the compressed fibers with mathematical precision, and he began reconnecting the India rubber tubing to the gasometer's altered valve with the careful attention of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. "Observe closely, Watson," he murmured, producing a small portion of chalk from his pocket and dropping it into a porcelain dish containing the remnants of muriatic acid discovered earlier. The familiar effervescence began immediately, delicate bubbles rising within the gasometer's chamber as Holmes worked the hand-operated pump with measured strokes. The sharp, medicinal odor that had permeated the room seemed to intensify momentarily, as though some ghostly echo of the previous evening's deadly experiment had been summoned back to life. Holmes struck a vesta and lowered the flickering flame along the side of Penrith's chair. At head height, it burned with steady confidence. At chest level, it wavered uncertainly. When he lowered it beneath the rim of the repositioned bell glass, it gasped and died with pathetic finality. "Carbon dioxide," he announced with quiet satisfaction. "Heavier than air and utterly hostile to human respiration. A lake of invisible death. Retained by the bell's seal and concentrated at precisely the level where a seated man would draw his final breaths." Mrs. Manley watched this demonstration with growing horror, her composed features reflecting the dawning understanding of the methodical cruelty that had claimed her employer's life. "But, sir, how could such a thing be arranged without Mr. Penrith's knowledge?" "Consider the victim's own scientific pursuits," Holmes replied, extinguishing and relighting his taper. "A man conducting pneumatic experiments would think nothing unusual of apparatus generating gas, particularly if the process were gradual and the initial concentrations insufficient to cause immediate alarm. The peppermint oil served a dual purpose, masking the sharp odor of the acid reaction while providing a familiar scent that would not arouse suspicion." The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor announced a new arrival, and moments later a tall, sharp-featured gentleman entered the study with the measured stride of one accustomed to commanding courtroom attention. Mr. Julius Varden possessed the aquiline profile that young Tommy had described, his dark overcoat still bearing droplets of fog like scattered diamonds. He carried an ivory-headed walking stick with unconscious authority, though his keen eyes betrayed a flicker of anxiety as they swept across the scientific apparatus arranged throughout the room. "Gentlemen," Varden began without preamble, his voice carrying the precise diction of legal training, "I received Inspector Lestrade's urgent summons regarding poor Penrith's tragic demise. A shocking business, truly shocking." His gaze lingered on the bell glass with evident distaste. I trust this investigation will proceed with due regard for the deceased's reputation and the confidential nature of his legal affairs. Holmes regarded the newcomer with that deceptive mildness which invariably preceded his most penetrating inquiries. Your professional relationship with Mr. Penrith extended to evening consultations, I perceive. The urgency of these visits suggests matters of considerable delicacy. Penrith had conceived certain charitable intentions requiring proper documentation. Varden replied with studied casualness. A man of his means naturally sought legal guidance regarding the disposition of his estate, particularly given his concerns about certain family members' financial habits. Your ivory ferrule bears traces of a distinctive grey powder, the same carbonate of lime we have discovered throughout this study. Perhaps you could explain how legal consultations might involve exposure to such chemical residues. Varden glanced down at his stick with apparent surprise, noting the faint dusting that clung to its tip. I cannot account for such contamination. This house reeks of chemical experiments. Doubtless the powder is omnipresent. Yet Mrs. Manley maintains exemplary cleanliness, Holmes observed. The powder appears only in locations directly associated with the gas-generating apparatus. Your stick has been in contact with these mechanisms quite recently, suggesting familiarity with their operation that extends beyond casual observation. The barrister's hawk-like features hardened with displeasure, though his voice remained professionally controlled. I resent any implication of impropriety, Mr. Holmes. My relationship with Penrith was strictly professional, and my movements yesterday are readily verifiable. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his expression grave with mounting evidence. Professional relationships can encompass many forms of collaboration, Mr. Varden. The question remains whether yours involved the careful orchestration of scientific theatre designed to conceal murder most ingenious. Varden's sharp features assumed the rigid composure of a man accustomed to courtroom battles, though the slight tremor in his voice betrayed the strain of maintaining professional dignity under increasingly damning scrutiny. Mr. Holmes, I must protest these unfounded accusations most strenuously. My presence in this house yesterday was entirely legitimate, conducted in my capacity as Mr. Penrith's legal adviser regarding matters of considerable delicacy. Holmes moved with deliberate precision to the overturned bell glass, lifting it carefully to examine its ground rim in the pale November light. With his pocket lens, he scrutinized the wax residue that had ensured the apparatus's deadly seal. Your protestations would carry greater weight, Mr. Varden, were it not for this. He produced a small sample of the grey powder scraped from the barrister's walking stick, holding it between thumb and forefinger, like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. Carbonate of lime, generated by the precise chemical reaction that filled this chamber with suffocating gas. Your stick bears the unmistakable traces of direct contact with the apparatus. Circumstantial contamination, Varden replied with forced confidence, though his knuckles had whitened where they gripped his ivory-headed cane. This entire house reeks of chemical experiments. Any visitor would inevitably carry such residues. Mrs. Manley, who had remained respectfully silent throughout this exchange, stepped forward with the quiet authority that 16 years of faithful service had earned her. If I may, gentlemen, Mr. Varden's explanation troubles me considerably. He visited twice yesterday, not once as he has implied. The second visit occurred after 6 o'clock, when Mr. Penrith had already secured himself in this study for his crucial experiment. Holmes's grey eyes sharpened with renewed interest. You admitted him despite your master's explicit instructions regarding disturbances. Mr. Varden produced a key to the front door, sir, claiming that Mr. Penrith had provided it for urgent legal matters. He proceeded directly to this study and knocked repeatedly, calling out that immediate action was required regarding charitable trust documents. When no response came, he departed after perhaps 15 minutes, stating that he would return this morning to complete the necessary arrangements. Varden's hawk-like profile had assumed an almost marble-like rigidity, though his voice retained its professional modulation. Penrith had indeed provided access for emergencies. When I found him unresponsive to my calls, I naturally assumed he had fallen asleep at his work and chose not to disturb him further. Holmes knelt beside the door jamb, his pocket lens revealing fresh scratches around the keyhole that gleamed like accusations written in brass. Your emergency key, Mr. Varden, appears to have required considerable manipulation. These marks are recent, their bright edges catching the light like evidence of hasty work performed under pressure. He withdrew from his pocket the length of fine wire discovered earlier, its flattened loop still bearing traces of metal filings. This ingenious device allowed the door to be locked from within while the operator remained safely in the corridor. A twin mechanism operated the gasometer's valve, flooding the sealed chamber with death while you maintained your alibi elsewhere. The barrister's composure finally began to crack, his professional mask slipping to reveal the calculating mind beneath. These wild theories prove nothing beyond your talent for theatrical speculation. I demand specific charges and immediate access to legal representation. Holmes rose gracefully, brushing dust from his knees with characteristic precision. The charges, Mr. Varden, center upon the methodical murder of Oswald Penrith through the perversion of scientific knowledge to criminal purpose, your intimate familiarity with his experimental habits, your convenient possession of house keys, your presence during the critical evening hours, and your professional access to his financial arrangements create a constellation of evidence that would satisfy any reasonable jury. He moved to the desk where Penrith's correspondence lay scattered among legal documents, lifting a half-finished letter with deliberate care. This draft codicil reveals your motive with crystalline clarity. Your client intended to establish a charitable foundation that would absorb the bulk of his considerable estate, effectively disinheriting his spendthrift nephew while providing you with a lucrative administrative position. However, the timing suggests he had begun to reconsider these arrangements, perhaps questioning the wisdom of concentrating such power in the hands of his legal advisor. Varden's eyes darted toward the study door as though calculating the distance to freedom, but Lestrade had positioned himself strategically to block any retreat. Penrith's charitable intentions were noble, but impractical. I merely advised caution regarding such substantial commitments. Caution, Holmes repeated with sardonic emphasis, expressed through the classical injunction, respice, look back. Yet your client chose to look forward, toward a future that would leave you with significantly reduced influence over his considerable fortune. The foreign correspondence that arrived yesterday morning undoubtedly contained information that threatened your carefully constructed plans, perhaps from Italian associates who had discovered irregularities in your handling of previous estates. Holmes struck a match and held the flickering flame at various levels throughout the room, demonstrating how the invisible lake of carbon dioxide had concentrated at precisely the height where a seated man would draw his final breaths. The beauty of your method lay in its apparent impossibility, a locked room, scientific apparatus that suggested accidental death, and medical evidence so extraordinary that it would dominate all discussion while deflecting attention from the true cause. You counted upon the sensational nature of the man who never breathed to obscure the mundane reality of calculated murder. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor announced the return of Holmes's messenger, bearing news that would either confirm his deductions or force a complete revision of the case. The fog outside pressed more closely against the windows, as though the very atmosphere recognized that the moment of truth had finally arrived in the house where science had been perverted to serve the cause of murder most ingenious. The constable who burst through the study doorway bore the unmistakable signs of urgent haste, his uniform dampened by fog and his breathing labored from rapid transit through London's maze-like streets. He carried 2 telegrams, their yellow forms bearing the official seals that marked communications of considerable importance. Lestrade seized them with barely concealed eagerness, tearing open the first with hands that trembled slightly from anticipation rather than cold. Lionel Penrith apprehended at Brighton Station, attempting to board the Dover Express, Lestrade announced, his voice carrying the satisfaction of vindicated suspicion. Local constabulary reports he carried nearly £300 in gold sovereigns, claiming racing winnings but unable to provide supporting documentation. He has been detained pending further investigation. Holmes's grey eyes sharpened with the light of completed calculation, though his expression remained composed. "The second telegram, Inspector?" Lestrade's features hardened as he scanned the remaining message. "From Florence, forwarded through your Baker Street lodgings. A firm of Italian solicitors confirms that Mr. Penrith had recently commissioned them to investigate substantial irregularities in charitable donations administered through Mr. Varden's office. The investigation revealed systematic misappropriation of funds destined for Italian orphanages, with evidence suggesting deliberate embezzlement spanning several years. The effect upon Varden was immediate and devastating. His hawk-like composure, maintained with such professional dignity throughout our investigation, finally began to crack like ice under sudden pressure. His knuckles whitened where they gripped his walking stick, and his carefully modulated voice acquired a sharp edge of desperation. "These are scurrilous fabrications designed to destroy my professional reputation," he declared, though the tremor in his voice betrayed the strain of maintaining such protestations. Penrith was prone to flights of fancy, particularly regarding financial matters he barely understood. Holmes moved with characteristic precision to the study's corner, where he knelt beside the gasometer and began tracing something along the skirting board with delicate fingers. "Your client understood enough to commission independent investigation, Mr. Varden. The Italian correspondence that arrived yesterday morning contained irrefutable evidence of your systematic theft. Mr. Penrith's crucial experiment was not merely scientific curiosity, but a desperate attempt to protect his remaining assets while preparing to expose your criminal activities." With surgical care, Holmes lifted the edge of the carpet to reveal a hair-thin copper wire that ran beneath the Persian rug toward the study threshold. His pocket lens emerged as he followed its path with the concentration of a surgeon tracing a vital nerve. "Observe, gentlemen, the true genius of this elaborate murder. The killer required no physical presence within this sealed chamber." He grasped the wire with thumb and forefinger, applying the slightest pressure. Immediately, a metallic click echoed from the gasometer, followed by the sinister hiss of escaping gas. "Stand back," Holmes commanded, simultaneously stamping the carpet edge to secure it while lunging toward the desk to clamp the India rubber tubing. The familiar sharp odor began to intensify as invisible death once again filled the lower atmosphere of the room. Holmes struck a match and demonstrated how the flame died at increasingly higher levels as the carbon dioxide accumulated. A lake of suffocating gas, controlled remotely by an operator safely positioned outside this chamber. The beauty of the method lay in its apparent impossibility, a locked room death that seemed to defy every principle of criminal investigation. Mrs. Manley, who had retreated to the doorway during this demonstration, watched with growing horror as the full scope of the conspiracy became apparent. "The foreign lady who visited a fortnight ago," she said quietly. She departed in evident distress, speaking rapidly in her native tongue. Could she have brought warnings about Mr. Varden's conduct? "Almost certainly," Holmes replied, following the copper wire as it disappeared beneath the door jamb and traced along the corridor toward the servants' quarters. Italian banking houses maintain meticulous records. International correspondence regarding charitable donations would naturally raise questions about irregular transactions and missing funds. We followed the wire's path in single file, Holmes leading with the focused intensity of a bloodhound following a scent. The filament led down the narrow servant's stair to the scullery, where Holmes examined the door's lockplate and lower panel with his characteristic thoroughness. He touched the door's edge and held up his finger, revealing a tiny crescent of brown wax. "Seal, broken and replaced," he murmured. Our operator required access to install his remote control mechanism and to withdraw undetected after the deed was accomplished. The scullery door opened onto a small yard, where the November fog hung like a theatrical curtain. Holmes immediately stooped over a damp patch near the drain, where recent cleansing had preserved two partial impressions in the soft earth. A narrow-soled boot with pronounced instep and Cuban heel, he observed, scarcely larger than a lady's size, and here the distinctive mark of a cane ferrule that slipped on the wet brick. He inhaled delicately, testing the air with the precision of a wine connoisseur. Peppermint oil, but with something sharper beneath the same medicinal odor that permeated young Tommy's description of his mysterious benefactor. Varden's professional mask was now completely shattered, revealing the calculating desperation beneath. "Half of London uses peppermint pastilles during winter months," he protested, though his voice had lost all conviction. "These circumstantial observations prove nothing beyond your talent for theatrical speculation." Holmes straightened, holding the wire's terminus where it emerged beneath the yard gate like evidence of guilt made manifest. "The wire extends beyond your property, Mr. Varden, allowing operation from a position of complete safety, combined with your intimate knowledge of Mr. Penrith's experimental habits, your possession of house keys, and your presence during the critical evening hours. We have a constellation of evidence that would satisfy any reasonable jury." He turned to Lestrade with renewed energy. "Inspector, young Lionel's flight to Brighton with unexplained wealth confirms his role as accomplice. The Italian correspondence establishes motive for both conspirators. Penrith's charitable foundation would have subjected all financial records to scrutiny that would inevitably expose years of systematic embezzlement." Holmes moved back toward the study, his expression grave with the weight of human folly, witnessed and criminal ingenuity exposed. The case of the man who never breathed reveals itself as masterful misdirection, where medical impossibility concealed mundane murder and scientific apparatus provided the perfect stage for deception. Yet one element remains unexplained, the precise timing mechanism that delayed the gas release until your alibi was firmly established. The fog outside seemed to press more closely against the windows, as though the very atmosphere recognized that the final pieces of this elaborate puzzle were about to fall into place. Varden stood frozen in the doorway, his hawk-like profile assuming the defeated aspect of a predator finally brought to bay, while the copper wire gleamed between Holmes's fingers like a thread connecting guilt to consequence in the most ingenious murder either of us had ever encountered. Holmes moved with characteristic precision back to the study, his grey eyes scanning the room with renewed purpose as the final pieces of this elaborate puzzle began to arrange themselves in his mind. He knelt beside the gasometer, his pocket lens revealing fresh scratches around the modified valve mechanism where hasty alterations had been made to accommodate an external triggering system. "The beauty of this method, gentlemen, lies not merely in its apparent impossibility, but in its elegant simplicity once properly understood," he began, producing a length of fine copper wire that disappeared beneath a loose floorboard near the study's threshold. Following its path with surgical precision, he traced the wire to where it terminated at a small brass mechanism concealed behind the skirting board, a modified pocket watch movement with its hands removed and a delicate spring-loaded trigger attached to the minute arbor. "A timing device of considerable ingenuity," Holmes observed, carefully extracting the mechanism. "Wound to release its trigger after a predetermined interval, allowing our murderer to establish his alibi hours before the deadly sequence commenced. The watch found stopped at 1:45 marks, not the moment of death, but the instant this crude automaton completed its function and jarred the victim's timepiece from the desk through its final mechanical convulsion." He moved to the overturned bell glass, positioning it precisely over the dark impression in the carpet where it had originally rested. The ground rim settled into the compressed fibers with mathematical accuracy, and Holmes examined the beeswax residue that had ensured a perfect seal with the intensity of a scholar deciphering ancient text. "But the true genius of this crime, Watson, lies not in the production of carbon dioxide, but in its removal," Holmes continued, his voice carrying that note of intellectual satisfaction which indicated complete understanding. "Mr. Penrith was convinced to participate in what he believed was a harmless scientific demonstration, perhaps an experiment in atmospheric pressure or air purification. The hand-operated pump, which we assumed was used to introduce gas, was actually employed to create a partial vacuum within the sealed bell glass. The implications struck me with horrifying clarity. A vacuum chamber. I breathed, my medical training immediately grasping the deadly consequences. His lungs would have been unable to inflate against the external pressure differential. Precisely, Watson. As the air was gradually withdrawn, Mr. Penrith would have found breathing increasingly difficult, not from the presence of noxious gas, but from the sheer impossibility of drawing breath against the vacuum. His lungs, unable to expand, would have collapsed in upon themselves, exhibiting precisely the characteristics that so puzzled Dr. Hatherley, organs that had seemingly never known the breath of life. Holmes produced from his waistcoat pocket a small brass button bearing the distinctive heraldic design of Lincoln's Inn, its surface dulled by recent exposure to chemical vapors. Discovered, wedged beneath the gasometer's base, where it fell during the hasty installation of the timing mechanism. Mr. Varden's overcoat bears an identical design, though I observe one button has been recently replaced with a substitute of slightly different patina. Varden's hawk-like composure finally began to crack, his professional mask slipping to reveal the calculating desperation beneath. His eyes darted, involuntarily toward his coat, where indeed a single button differed subtly from its companions in both age and positioning. The pinprick discovered upon the victim's forearm, Holmes continued relentlessly, marks the injection site where a quick-acting sedative was administered during your evening visit, Mr. Varden. This ensured Mr. Penrith remained compliant during the initial stages of the experiment, believing himself to be participating in legitimate scientific inquiry until consciousness faded and breathing became impossible. Holmes struck a match and demonstrated how the carbon dioxide, introduced after the vacuum had completed its deadly work, would have settled at the bottom of the chamber. The gas served a dual purpose, obscuring the true cause of death while providing the baffling medical evidence that would dominate all investigation. A man found dead in a sealed room, surrounded by apparatus suggesting accidental asphyxiation, with lungs that defied every principle of medical knowledge. Mrs. Manley, who had observed these revelations with growing horror, stepped forward with quiet dignity. The foreign lady who visited a fortnight ago spoke of stolen children's bread in her distress. I thought she referred to some charitable disappointment, but now I understand she had discovered the theft from Italian orphanages. The international investigation had reached its inevitable conclusion, Holmes confirmed. Mr. Penrith faced the choice between private settlement and public exposure of your systematic embezzlement. His decision to pursue justice rather than permit continued theft from charitable institutions sealed his fate. He turned to address Varden directly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Your nephew Lionel's role as accomplice becomes clear when we consider his convenient departure for Brighton with unexplained wealth. His regular Sunday visits provided detailed reconnaissance of his uncle's experimental habits, while his gambling debts supplied perfect motivation for collaboration in this elaborate deception. The barrister's professional dignity collapsed entirely, his voice acquiring a sharp edge of desperate justification. Penrith was a fool who understood nothing of practical finance. His charitable obsessions would have squandered a fortune that could have served more rational purposes. Rational purposes such as covering gambling debts and maintaining a lifestyle beyond your legitimate means, Holmes replied with cold emphasis. You perverted scientific curiosity into an instrument of murder, transforming your victim's own experimental chamber into a sealed tomb while maintaining the perfect alibi of professional consultation. Lestrade consulted his pocket watch with evident satisfaction. Mr. Holmes, the inquest jury awaits our findings. Shall I present them with a case of scientific accident or deliberate murder? Murder most ingenious, Holmes declared, his grey eyes bright with intellectual triumph. Accomplished through the perversion of scientific knowledge to criminal purpose, concealed by medical impossibility that would have deceived any observer lacking intimate familiarity with both pneumatic principles and human nature. The fog outside pressed more closely against the windows as Holmes prepared to demonstrate the complete sequence of events that had transformed a London study into the stage for one of the most elaborate murders in the annals of crime. The case of the man who never breathed was approaching its inevitable resolution, though the full scope of the conspiracy would require considerable investigation to unravel completely. Holmes positioned himself at the center of the study with theatrical precision, his grey eyes surveying the assembled evidence with the satisfaction of a conductor preparing to direct the final movement of a complex symphony. The modified gasometer, the overturned bell glass, the copper wire mechanism, and the brass timing device lay arranged like instruments, awaiting their ultimate performance in this chamber where scientific curiosity had been perverted to serve murder most ingenious. "Gentlemen," Holmes began, his voice carrying that distinctive blend of intellectual triumph and moral gravity which marked his most brilliant expositions, "allow me to reconstruct the complete sequence of events that transformed this study from a sanctuary of learning into a sealed tomb. Mr. Varden, your elaborate scheme required months of careful preparation, beginning with the systematic embezzlement of charitable funds destined for Italian orphanages and culminating in a murder method of remarkable sophistication." He lifted the bell glass with reverent precision, positioning it exactly over the dark impression in the carpet where it had claimed its victim's life. "Your first requirement was intimate knowledge of Mr. Penrith's experimental habits. Intelligence gathered through your nephew Lionel during his weekly visits. These Sunday consultations served dual purposes, maintaining the appearance of familial duty while conducting detailed reconnaissance of the study's layout and your uncle's scientific procedures." Holmes moved to the study door, demonstrating how the fine wire mechanism had been threaded beneath the carpet and through the keyhole. "The Italian correspondence that arrived yesterday morning contained irrefutable proof of your financial crimes, forcing immediate action to prevent exposure. You arranged an evening consultation under the pretense of urgent legal business, gaining access through the key Mr. Penrith had provided for legitimate emergencies." With surgical care, Holmes extracted the modified pocket watch mechanism from its concealment behind the skirting board. This crude automaton, wound to operate after a predetermined interval, controlled the final stage of your deception. But the true genius of your method, Mr. Varden, lay not in introducing poison into this chamber, but in removing the very essence of life itself, breathable air. He struck a match and held it at various levels throughout the room, demonstrating how the flame burned steadily at head height but guttered and died when lowered toward the carpet. Your victim was convinced to participate in what he believed was a harmless scientific demonstration, perhaps an experiment in atmospheric pressure or air purification. The sedative injection, administered through that tiny puncture wound on his forearm, ensured his compliance during the initial stages. Holmes positioned the bell glass over a lighted candle placed upon the desk, then began working the hand-operated pump with measured strokes. As he created a partial vacuum within the sealed chamber, the candle flame narrowed to a pinpoint and expired with pathetic finality. "Observe, gentlemen." The pump, which appeared to introduce beneficial gas into the sealed chamber, was actually employed to extract the air itself. As atmospheric pressure within the bell glass dropped, Mr. Penrith's lungs became unable to expand against the external pressure differential. The demonstration's implications struck me with horrifying clarity. The victim would have found breathing increasingly difficult, I observed, my medical training grasping the deadly mechanics. Not from the presence of noxious gas, but from the sheer physical impossibility of inflating his lungs against the vacuum. "Precisely, Watson. His respiratory system, unable to function against the pressure differential, would have collapsed inward, exhibiting precisely the characteristics that so puzzled Dr. Hatherley, organs that appeared never to have known the breath of life. Holmes produced the Lincoln's Inn button from his waistcoat pocket, its brass surface dulled by recent exposure to chemical vapors. This fell from your overcoat during the hasty installation of the timing mechanism, Mr. Varden. Your replacement button bears a different patina, marking it as recently acquired. He moved to the gasometer, demonstrating how the copper wire controlled its modified valve. After death had occurred, the timing device triggered the release of carbon dioxide gas, which settled at floor level due to its greater density than air. This served multiple purposes, obscuring the true cause of death, providing the baffling medical evidence that would dominate all investigation, and creating the sharp medicinal odor masked beneath peppermint oil. Mrs. Manley stepped forward with quiet dignity, her composed features reflecting the horror of complete understanding. The foreign lady who visited a fortnight ago spoke of stolen children's bread in her distress. She had discovered the theft from Italian orphanages and came to warn Mr. Penrith of your criminal activities. Holmes nodded gravely. The international investigation had reached its inevitable conclusion. Mr. Penrith faced the choice between private settlement and public exposure of systematic embezzlement spanning several years. His decision to pursue justice rather than permit continued theft from charitable institutions sealed his fate. Varden's hawk-like composure began to crack visibly, his professional mask slipping to reveal the calculating desperation beneath. These theatrical reconstructions prove nothing beyond your talent for dramatic speculation, Mr. Holmes. Circumstantial evidence and parlor tricks cannot what? Mr. Varden cannot establish that your walking stick bears the distinctive chalk residue found only on the gasometer's valve. Cannot explain the wire mechanism extending from this study to the scullery yard, where your narrow boot prints and cane marks remain in the damp earth. Cannot account for young Tommy's description of the sharp-nosed gentleman who urged haste and reeked of medicinal peppermints. He held aloft the length of copper wire like evidence of guilt made manifest. Your nephew Lionel's flight to Brighton with unexplained wealth confirms his role as accomplice. The boy's statement, already obtained by Inspector Lestrade, reveals how you convinced him to deliver peppermint oil and rubber tubing under the pretense of assisting his uncle's experiments. His gambling debts provided perfect motivation for collaboration in this elaborate deception. Holmes moved to the desk, where Penrith's correspondence lay scattered among legal documents, lifting the half-finished letter with deliberate care. The victim's final written words speak of altered charitable intentions and concerns about family members' financial habits. Combined with the foreign correspondence regarding missing funds, we see the complete scope of your conspiracy. The barrister's professional dignity collapsed entirely, his voice acquiring the sharp edge of desperate justification. Penrith was a naive fool who understood nothing of practical finance. His charitable obsessions would have squandered a fortune that could have served more rational purposes than feeding Italian street children. Holmes's grey eyes flashed with cold fire. Rational purposes such as covering gambling debts, maintaining a lifestyle beyond your legitimate means, and purchasing silence regarding systematic theft from charitable institutions. You transformed scientific curiosity into an instrument of murder. Mr. Varden, creating the perfect locked room mystery while maintaining an unassailable alibi. He turned to Lestrade with renewed energy. Inspector, we have before us not merely murder, but a conspiracy involving international fraud, systematic embezzlement, and the perversion of scientific knowledge to criminal purpose. The evidence forms an unbreakable chain. Motive established through the Italian investigation, opportunity provided by house keys, and intimate knowledge of the victim's habits, and method demonstrated through this apparatus modified for deadly purpose. The fog outside seemed to press more closely against the windows, as though the very atmosphere recognized that justice was finally approaching in this chamber where elaborate deception had concealed murder most ingenious. Holmes prepared his final demonstration, the complete reconstruction that would transform this sealed study from a scene of baffling impossibility into clear evidence of calculated crime. The case of the man who never breathed reveals itself as masterful misdirection, Holmes declared with quiet satisfaction, where medical impossibility concealed mundane murder and scientific apparatus provided the perfect stage for deception. Yet the truth, once properly illuminated, proves as inexorable as the laws of physics that made this crime possible. At 3 o'clock precisely, the inquest jury filed solemnly into the study itself, their faces bearing that mixture of fascination and dread which accompanies proximity to extraordinary crime. Dr. Hatherley stood beside them with professional gravity, while Lestrade positioned constables at every exit, his warrant ready in hand. Holmes surveyed the assembled company with characteristic composure, then began his final demonstration with the methodical precision of a master craftsman, revealing his most intricate work. "Gentlemen of the jury," Holmes began, his voice carrying that distinctive authority which commanded absolute attention, "you have been presented with an impossibility, a man who died as though he had never drawn breath. Allow me to reveal the 3 layers of elaborate deception that created this medical mystery, while concealing murder most ingenious." He moved first to the study door, demonstrating how the fine wire mechanism threaded through the keyhole. The first deception was the sealed room itself. This simple device, operated from the corridor after the key was turned within, created the perfect illusion of internal locking, while allowing the murderer to establish his alibi hours before death occurred. Holmes positioned the bell glass over its original impression in the carpet, the ground rim settling with mathematical precision into the compressed fibers. The second deception involved the very nature of death itself. Mr. Penrith was convinced to participate in what he believed was a beneficial scientific experiment. The sedative injection, evidenced by that tiny puncture on his forearm, ensured compliance during the critical initial stages. With deliberate care, Holmes demonstrated the hand-operated pump, creating a partial vacuum within the sealed chamber. A lighted candle placed beneath the glass narrowed to a pinpoint and expired with pathetic finality. This pump, which appeared to introduce beneficial gas, actually withdrew the air itself. As atmospheric pressure dropped, Mr. Penrith's lungs became unable to expand against the external differential. His respiratory system collapsed inward, exhibiting precisely the characteristics that so puzzled Dr. Hatherley, organs that had seemingly never known the breath of life. The timing mechanism, extracted from its concealment behind the skirting board, revealed the final element of the conspiracy. The third deception was the introduction of carbon dioxide after death had occurred. This crude automaton, wound to operate hours after the murderer's departure, triggered the gas release that settled at floor level, providing the baffling medical evidence while masking the true cause of death beneath a sharp medicinal odor disguised with peppermint oil. Holmes moved to the desk where the blotter lay, holding it to the light at a careful angle. But perhaps the most telling evidence lies here, in Mr. Penrith's final written words. He pressed the blotter against a clean sheet and drew it away, revealing reversed impressions that arranged themselves with damning clarity. Julius Varden, transfer of trusteeship administration fees. Florentine, remittance irregularities. The effect upon Varden was immediate and devastating. His hawk-like composure shattered completely as he realized the trap his victim had unknowingly prepared. "Respice," Holmes observed quietly. "Look back," the very word that required a backward glance to reveal its author's final, inverted memorandum of suspicion. "Mrs." Manley stepped forward with quiet dignity. The foreign lady who visited spoke of stolen children's bread in her distress. She had discovered the theft from Italian orphanages and came to warn Mr. Penrith of criminal activities conducted in his name. Varden's professional mask collapsed entirely, his voice acquiring the sharp edge of desperate justification. Penrith was a sanctimonious fool whose charitable obsessions would have squandered a fortune. Those Italian street children were already receiving adequate support from other sources, support that you systematically diverted to cover gambling debts and maintain a lifestyle beyond your legitimate means. Holmes replied with cold precision. In a sudden, unwise dash toward the corridor, Varden made his final gambit for freedom, but Lestrade intercepted him neatly, the ivory-headed cane clattering to the boards. From its hollow ferrule, Holmes extracted a coil of copper wire, stained with brown wax where it had controlled the deadly mechanism. A messenger from Brighton arrived with gratifying punctuality, bearing news that Lionel Penrith had confessed to his role as accomplice, believing the scheme merely intended to frighten his uncle into signing favourable financial arrangements. The inquest concluded with the proper verdict that Oswald Penrith met his death by felonious contrivance. The perpetrators now identified and apprehended. As we departed Welbeck Street through the thickening fog, Holmes reflected with characteristic philosophy. There is melancholy in such cases, Watson, where charity becomes the pretext for theft and science the cloak for murder. Yet truth, like oxygen, allows society to breathe freely once more. Back at Baker Street, he placed the Lincoln's Inn button upon the mantel between the Persian slipper and coal scuttle, drew his violin, and played a grave, simple air that seemed to cleanse the very atmosphere. "The case of the man who never breathed," he murmured finally, "proves that even the most elaborate deception cannot long withstand the patient application of logical method to observable fact." The fog had lifted considerably by the time Varden was led away in shackles, his professional dignity finally abandoning him as the full weight of his crimes became manifest. His confession, extracted with methodical precision by Inspector Lestrade, revealed the complete scope of the conspiracy that had transformed a London study into a sealed tomb. Young Lionel's telegraphed admission from Brighton confirmed his role as unwitting accomplice, his gambling debts having made him vulnerable to his uncle's murderer, though his genuine horror at learning the true nature of the plot ultimately secured him a reduced sentence of 18 months' imprisonment rather than the gallows. Within a fortnight, the Italian authorities had commenced proceedings to recover the £12,000 systematically diverted from charitable institutions across the Mediterranean. Signora Benedetti, the courageous sister of the Mother Superior, who had risked the Channel crossing to warn Penrith of the embezzlement, received official recognition from both governments for her role in exposing the international fraud. Mrs. Manley secured comfortable employment with a family in Bloomsbury, her impeccable references ensuring immediate acceptance despite the tragic circumstances that had befallen her previous household. The trial of Julius Varden became a sensation throughout London, though not for the reasons the barrister had originally intended. His elaborate scheme to create the man who never breathed served only to demonstrate how intellectual arrogance could pervert scientific knowledge to murderous purpose. Dr. Hatherley's testimony regarding the vacuum-induced lung collapse provided the medical community with invaluable insights, while the detailed exposition of the timing mechanisms and remote-controlled apparatus fascinated engineers and criminologists alike. "A most instructive case," Holmes observed as we settled before our Baker Street fire some weeks later, the evening papers bearing final accounts of Varden's execution at Pentonville. "The criminal mind, Watson, often defeats itself through excessive cleverness. Had Varden simply poisoned his victim or employed more conventional methods, he might have escaped detection entirely. Instead, his desire to create an impossible mystery provided us with the very clues necessary for his apprehension." I stirred my tea thoughtfully, still haunted by the image of that overturned bell glass and its deadly purpose. "The perversion of scientific inquiry troubles me greatly, Holmes. To transform instruments of learning into weapons of murder seems particularly heinous." "Indeed," he replied, drawing thoughtfully upon his pipe, "yet we must remember that science itself remains pure. It was human avarice and intellectual pride that corrupted Penrith's experimental apparatus to serve such base purposes. The same pneumatic principles that Varden employed for murder might equally serve to preserve life in medical applications." Holmes rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the familiar bustle of Baker Street, where ordinary London life proceeded with customary indifference to the extraordinary dramas that unfolded within our modest lodgings. The case reminds us that truth, like oxygen, will always find its way to the surface when subjected to proper analytical pressure. Varden's elaborate deceptions ultimately collapsed under the weight of accumulated evidence. The wire mechanism, the timing device, the chemical residues, and most tellingly, his victim's final memorandum pressed backward into the blotter like an accusation written in reverse. A sharp rap upon our door announced the arrival of a breathless street Arab bearing a telegram from Inspector Lestrade. Holmes tore it open with characteristic precision, his grey eyes immediately brightening with renewed interest. "Most intriguing, Watson," he announced, setting aside his pipe with sudden energy. "Lestrade reports a curious matter in Whitechapel involving a locked strong room, a missing diamond merchant, and a mechanical device that appears to operate without any visible source of power. The local constabulary is completely baffled." I reached for my hat and coat with the familiar anticipation that marked the beginning of our adventures. "Another impossible mystery, Holmes." "So, it would appear," he replied with that thin smile which indicated his complete intellectual satisfaction with the world's endless capacity for presenting logical puzzles. "Though after our recent experience with vacuum chambers and remote-controlled mechanisms, I find myself somewhat skeptical of impossibilities in general." As we descended into the fog-shrouded streets of London, I reflected that the case of the man who never breathed had taught us that even the most elaborate deceptions yield their secrets to patient observation and methodical reasoning. The pursuit of truth, like the breath of life itself, remains essential to human society.